I'm going to introduce everyone in a moment. I'm just going to explain how the panel is going to work. First, there's going to be a Slido. I'm about to forward through that. It's just something for the audience to sort of vote on before we start a discussion. Then I'm going to introduce the panel, and each of them will have 5 minutes to set out their stall, and then we'll have a Q&A. Okay, so without any further ado, I think this should work. Going to Slido, help, if not. I'm not sure where I'm supposed to be pointing. Sorry, I'm just standing in case, is it here? That didn't work. Sorry, I think it's because I'm pushing it and they're pushing it. Apologies. Right. So there you've got a question there. To what extent do you agree with the following statement? The higher education sector has a responsibility to tackle inequalities and drive social mobility. I don't entirely agree, totally disagree. We've got 10 votes. I'm gonna wait until we see at least 30 votes before I start commenting. Okay, that's looking good. So, for the benefit particularly of Lord Willits on the call, we've got we're going to get about 70 voters here in the audience, 70% of whom totally agree with the statement that higher education has a responsibility to tackle inequalities and drive social mobility. 20% someone agree, 6% totally disagree, and 3% don't entirely agree. So, fair to say, very strong agreement. In fact, towards the total agreement. The agreeers in total are well over 90%, but there is a small minority who disagree. Right, so that's the context a bit for this conversation about the role of higher education in Britain, the extent to which tackling inequality is one of those aims, but also universities are here to be anchor institutions in communities, to drive research agendas, to level up. There's a lot of things being asked of universities, and in that context, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to set out their stall of the role of universities today. So I'm going to start with Lord David Willits. He's the former Minister of State for Universities and Science. And as I said, I'm really grateful that you're able to join us today. Thank you.
Well, and thank you very much for the opportunity to join your panel. I'm only sorry I can't be with you in person. I am in Westminster and can't get away for this, I'm afraid. Just some quick comments. As you rightly said, there's a whole host of different roles of universities. If I were going to pick one or two that are particularly salient now, I would make two suggestions. The first is indeed the civic role. You referred to universities as anchor institutions, and they have fantastic capacity to serve a place and transform a town or a city. And if I may say so, I think Mary Stewart and what has happened at the University of Lincoln is a wonderful example of that. But there are places where the university is seen as a kind of spacecraft that's temporarily landed and has insufficient connection with its own area and insufficient sense of responsibility for helping in everything from understanding social problems in the area through to promoting economic growth in the area. So I think the civic role is back in fashion, and in the era of levelling up and in the era of edu-skepticism, and I think often unfair hostility to universities, discharging that role is really important. And then I would add a second role, and which I don't know if has been touched on earlier in your conference, but is a really fraught and tricky area. It's freedom of speech. It is how people conduct themselves when they have genuine disagreements, but are all sharing in the life of a very diverse community. And that is in many ways the challenge that entire national societies face. And they are often particularly vivid and particularly scrutinized in universities. I actually think universities have a really important potential role of showing how that can be done. And that means, of course, putting freedom of speech center stage and understanding that there will be disagreement, but doing so in a way that people from a whole range of backgrounds with a whole range of personal beliefs don't feel threatened and instead feel that their viewpoint is respected. And I think that challenge, which is very topical at the moment, and there are some universities and student unions which work together in an incredibly mature way to ensure there's a very wide range of speakers who can come to a university campus, and students also recognize that there are ways in which we address each other, including when we disagree. I think that's a really rich and important role for universities, and they can be a model for society as a whole. As this is transforming access and student outcomes, and as you're celebrating your first anniversary, and congratulations on that. And I personally, as a visiting professor at King's College, am very excited. I know King's has been involved in this from the beginning. I would just add, of course, third, that crucial role on social mobility, which came out strongly in your poll. And we should be proud of what universities can do. Universities are the only stage of education where people who arrive from more disadvantaged areas outperform. They are the one area where you actually can gain some ground by virtue of being at university, and that is fantastic, and we can be proud of that. But of course, how universities recruit is incredibly sensitive and important. If they can't get in the first place, they're not going to have that advantage. And another area where I think we now understand more clearly the importance of help is post-university. And look, when 9K fees came in and we allocated, up to £1,000 of that for spending on access, the focus was very much on helping people from disadvantaged backgrounds get in. And the record of the past 10 years has been very good. There's still more to be done, but we've made considerable progress, which, given the anxieties people had, I think is an achievement in itself. However, one of the most shocking statistics is that for any given level of degree attainment, when graduates go out into the jobs market, those who are more socially advantaged will get better paid jobs and will secure better opportunities than those who come from less advantaged backgrounds. And that problem can't be solely and exclusively tackled by universities, but universities can help. And I think we're seeing now a rebalancing of access spend. So it's not just help people get in, it's to help people move on afterwards. So it's helping them secure and perhaps even help fund the costs of internships or work experience that would otherwise be inaccessible to students from disadvantaged backgrounds. It's ensuring that they get access to networks as rich as those which more advantaged students have. So I think that's a part of the access agenda, transforming access, your whole role, where I think we can expect to see more attention. But look, you have done a fantastic job in the first year, and I wish you all the best for future success in your important role.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you for being here from a vote in the Lords and for those kind words as well. I'm going to now move to Mary Stewart, who is, as Lord Willits has said, was previously Vice Chancellor at the University of Lincoln and now is Director of Leadership Development at Minerva.
Thanks very much. So I think that I agree with a lot of what David was saying there, but I think I might want to put it slightly differently. The reason why I was so absolutely passionate about ensuring that my university contributed positively to place is because I think the fundamental purpose of universities is to create and share knowledge for the benefit of society. That's what we're about. That's our purpose. And we do that through education, and we do that through research, and we must do it with our communities. I think that's really, really crucial. Now, one of those communities is, of course, the university community itself. And in that context, I agree, we have to learn how to disagree well with each other. And that's where actually I think the social sciences are really important, because people learn that process of debate and argument through that context. And that's where I think we can add value to learning to disagree well. But fundamentally, when one's talking about widening access, and I have spent my entire career working in this, I was sitting there, I'm very old now, I was sitting there listening to people talking about the need to work with families, and I thought, oh my God, that's where I started. I started in family education, you know, and what goes around comes around. But it is absolutely the case, and it's so good to see that we have finally recognized that we need to work with adults again. So good. But I think there is a connection between the work that we do in widening participation and now into employability, because it is really important that people can progress in their lives, that they can have better lives, and for their parents, that they can see their children grow into things that they had wanted for themselves. That is important, but there's a direct connection between all that work and what we do in place. And I want to give you one example from my previous institution, Lincoln. When I started as Vice Chancellor there, I realized that many of our students wished to stay once they'd graduated in the area. They'd chosen to come to Lincoln. They loved the city. It's a beautiful city. If you've never been, you should go. But they couldn't get, there were very few graduate jobs. And Lincoln itself needed work done through a whole systems leadership between the council, the university, schools, the whole gamut of people, the cultural industry, organizations like, you know, that worked with disability groups. We all needed to come together to improve place and to work with local people. Many of the businesses were small businesses who weren't, the owners weren't graduates themselves. So they had no idea what a graduate could bring to the business. So I think there's a direct connection between those two things. And I think that is the best way of illustrating that main purpose, that we create and share knowledge for the benefit of our society.
Thank you, Mary. And thank to both of my first speakers for sticking to the 5-minute brief. I'm now heading over to Hilary Giabi Ababio, who is Vice President of Higher Education at the National Union of Students. Great to see you, Hilary.
Lovely to be here. I don't know what to say. I could say anything, couldn't I?
Absolutely.
Yes. Hi. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. I always am drawn to anything to do with access and supporting students, partly because it's where I came from. I was a widening participation student, which is like, I often have the moral quandary of, after I finished education, can I still like use that as my like personality? Can my personality be that I can still have that on me? But I guess the point of university is that, you know, when students are able to come in, they're able to do and engage enough that they would be able to find newer, bigger, better, much more fruitful opportunities than if they weren't able to access higher education. And in some ways, I'm able to do this. I'm sitting on the stage and I have the privilege of having this platform to speak to you and to talk to you about, you know, what I think higher education is about, and I've been harping on about that for the past 2 years, so you could probably Google my name. I've got many opinions. But I do think there is something to be said about, you know, when we think about higher education, it's really easy to speak about it in theory. You know, theoretically, higher education is here for the purpose of the betterment of society. In theory, it's a great place to really think about how we can educate people and equip them with the tools to navigate the world. But I reckon there's a point here that I have to make from the student perspective that really speaks to the fact that, you know, in theory, all of those things are good things. In practice, that's not the reality. You know, I hear time and time again from students around, you know, the heightened reality of what it feels like to be in a place where it's essentially a microcosm of society. And I think that's a vice versa thing. You know, people come from different backgrounds and different lifestyles and different upbringings, and they bring that all into a space, and you sort of put everybody together and just like leave them to it, right? And I think in many ways that means that you reproduce where everyone has come from, you reproduce sort of what people are experiencing. You know, when I speak to students from racialized and minoritized backgrounds, they tell me about, you know, the heightened reality of what it feels like to experience systemic racism, for example, in their institutions, to really feel the reality of class being alive in our society, even though nobody really talks about it anymore. If you hear about class, it's a bit like, what's that? Who's that? Don't know her. And I think there's something to be said around, and I think a lot about that poll, that higher education has a responsibility for students, to students, and to the communities and the people that engage with them. And that includes staff, that includes organizations in the sector, that includes wider society. And in many ways, higher education has proved a bedrock for many ideas and approaches in our society that have formed the world we live in. And so I don't think we can avoid, taking responsibility for the fact that as much as we absorb the society around us, we also shape it around us. And we do need to, be mindful of that. Systemic racism and injustices don't appear out of nowhere. Nobody corroborates those ideas with just air. It comes from people that have sat down and have been able to have platforms to solidify those ideas as objective truths and not bring in the other perspectives and narratives that have been blocked out. What I will say on a bit more of a lighter note, though, is that I think we do have an opportunity to change, and I think we have an opportunity to transform. I see in the way students are being much more vocal. I used to think that, being in this job would be me, like, bringing students together, being like, I've got you in a room with the people that need to hear what you have to say. Go for it. And now I get emails being like, can you get me into a room with Omar? This hasn't happened yet, but if it does, I'll put you into a room with them. But like, can you get me into a room with whosoever? I think there's something they really need to hear. And students are ready to talk about what they expect from a higher education system. And actually, I think we should include further education in here too. What they expect, their responsibility to them as students, but also what they expect to be able to feel part of that community and feel that they can be proud of the education that they've achieved. And so what I will say is that I do think universities have a social as well as an educational responsibility. I do think that universities have a responsibility to navigate what it's like for people from different backgrounds, different ideologies, different spaces to come together. But I think there has to be a space where we talk about the rules of engagement in that, because far too many students, staff, people have been harmed in university and higher education and further education spaces, and that's been unchallenged for a long time. And so whilst we can talk about freedom of speech, I'm always happy to, I think we need to think about what do we need to do to first protect the people that are most vulnerable in those spaces before we go on a free-for-all for everybody to say things without recognition of the harm that can bring. But that is to say, higher education is a great thing. Education is a great thing. I think everyone should be able to access those opportunities. And I think this is what we need to work out as a sector, how we unify on doing that and doing that well for everyone involved. The end.
Excellent. And finally, we have Dr. Saul Gamsu from the Department of Sociology at Durham University.
Hi, I hope you can hear me. I'm going to give a little bit of a survey of the policy landscape of the last 12 or so years, which might be a little bit different from some of the things we've heard before, but also some areas of agreement. I think we've had a decade, or at least a decade, of quite contradictory policy in higher education. Students have huge debts on graduation, and the terms of those debts have recently been made worse. And those fees and loans have been introduced by many people who went to university for free. If you combine that with housing costs, with inflation, with stagnant pay, you've got a recipe for massive intergenerational inequality for our students. And we live and teach and learn in a society, I think, that requires deep transformation and democratization to be able to offer hope for the students that we all work with. And I think that governments have actually created quite a hostile environment for young people, as well as for the minoritized and marginalized groups. Thinking about social mobility and access in universities, I think there are policy riddles here and contradiction, as well as grounds for hope, and hope in the work that I'm sure many of the people in this room and on the call are involved in. Because there have been significant successes over the last 10 years, many of which you will have been involved in around access and WP. I think they've probably been the silver linings against some quite dark clouds in the broader educational landscape. And if we think about WP more specifically, from the late 2000s, and particularly after 2010, we saw the focus of WP really turn quite sharply towards entry to elites and elite universities, or top jobs, if you prefer that. And the broader conceptions of access, which were present in some form and during the New Labour years, really were minimised. And that's things like lifelong learning initiatives falling by the wayside, the effects of recession, austerity, and changes to fees, resulting in big falls in part-time and mature students, college mergers, cuts to post-16 budgets, attacks on so-called low-quality courses and institutions. All of that, I think, has made the context for access and participation in universities narrower, and education more broadly, narrower and more austere and restricted. We've also seen cuts to regional development funding, resulting in the closure of satellite campuses in some parts of the country. And in so-called red wall or so-called left-behind areas, we've also seen the closure of campuses, the closure of departments in places like Crewe and Sunderland, to name just 2 examples. So whilst government and other actors have emphasised access to elite universities, at the same time there's been this narrowing of what access actually means and the material basis for that in education more broadly. Now we've got the levelling up agenda, quote unquote, which also dovetails possibly with Augur to create some uncertainty around HE funding. And for some, levelling up also means pitting FE against HE. That's not, in my view, about redistribution or greater funding for FE. And from my perspective, that's more of a sort of circus of politics that pits educational sectors against each other to distract us from what is actually at stake. And the last decade of education policy and the levelling up agenda, I would say, as part of that, is contradictory. And it focuses on appearing to unpick the education cuts and the narrow access agendas that have been shaped over the last 10 years, whilst actually generally seeking to save money from education budgets. So I'm not sure if there's actually a genuine commitment to levelling up in a way that goes beyond rhetoric. If so, that would require a deep redistribution of educational and economic resources in universities, colleges, schools, and beyond. And I'm not sure that the current government is really capable of resolving those contradictions of class and race that sustain, some of the core support for and core vote bases of this government. I think marketisation. I want to turn briefly to where we need to go. So marketisation of higher education is always a political choice, in my view. I think there are possibilities for universities which offer less toxic working and learning conditions for staff and students, and positive things that can be done, have been done over the last 10 years to achieve that. There are lots of challenges within HE to confront: inequalities between post-92 and pre-92, between HE and FE. Elitism is a terrible principle to organise an educational system around, and yet that's what we've had for 150 years. Ingrained sexism, sexual violence on campus, lack of representation of black and brown staff, decolonisation of higher education, the ending of tuition fees, the end of chronic precarity, cultures of overwork, pointless research exercises, rankings, league tables, protecting pensions, ending outsourcing in higher education, student housing co-ops instead of PBSAs. There's quite a lot of work to do. And I co-edited some writing on this for class for the Centre of Labour and Social Studies in 2019, and I think there's still mileage in those ideas, even if the context win's quite different. We can act progressively in and against the current system, and I'm sure lots of people here do that on a daily basis. How do we get to where we need to be? I think that requires organisation. We're on the cusp of the first marking boycott in higher education in 16 years, and for staff to be considering taking such serious action is a sign of just how bad things are in some places. Strong unions, UCU, NUS, local SUs, campus unions, acting together is essential to create change from below. And there's also space for progressive leadership in higher education as part of that, and university leaders need to think about how they act, and people more broadly need to come together. It's a long process, but I think putting these things on the agenda, building the organisation, building the change that is building the movements that are capable of arguing for those changes is the only viable option for a more progressive higher education system and a more sustainable future for everyone.
Thank you. Thank you to all of my speakers for setting out a very clear stall. I think it was very good to hear those different perspectives. We have 15 minutes, so I think I will go immediately to the audience, actually, because we've got quite a number of you and some also online, potentially. Any questions? And if you have one for a specific panel member, please do say so. I see Renata here. I'm just thinking, is there anyone else as well? Well, we'll just take the one first then.
So my name is Renata, and I work at SOAS. Hillary, I got in touch with you actually earlier this year. You're probably buried in your, huge amount of emails that you receive. But that was one of the concerns I've had when I heard about the new policy about raising attainment, because we know that real funding in early education has been falling. We know that FE has been starved of funding for years. And I have a podcast. I've interviewed a few people to interview you. And I wanted to know, from the student perspective, really, the debt is a big issue. We're talking about cost of living crisis that might push payment backs by 10% because it's 3%, is RPI plus 3%. That seems to me so unfair. And the money is there. I understand there was lacking of money over there. I understand all of that. But it's the issue that Saud mentioned about plugging money from one end to another. How does the National Union students see all that, please?
Yeah, I think that's a hugely important question. It's a great question because that's all I've been speaking about for the past few months, and I'm sure even when I have no title, I'll still be speaking about it into the ether. Just follow me on Twitter and you'll just see all my musings. I think this is a really interesting question because often when we think about universities, I think sometimes people make the grave mistake of thinking that universities are bubbles and then everything that happens in the real world just doesn't exist there. It's like cost of living crisis, of course students aren't dealing with that. It's not like they're renting and having to pay energy bills and having to pay rents that are too expensive or having to afford food. And for the first time in my short time relatively in the student movement, I found myself in a space speaking to students that are just asking for basic necessities. I never thought, in this job, I would ever have to ask, I would ever have to say students need money because they cannot afford food. That was just nothing came into my mind about that. When I was campaigning and doing a cute little music video, I was like, the government's whack, I'm gonna do something about it. And then, I come into this role and it's like, okay, so students are starving, they can't afford bills, graduates are that 12% interest on student loans for the next 6 months. On top of that, students that are going into university in September are gonna be paying for 40 years and start repaying at a lower rate. Students are frightened to be in higher education right now. And I think this is particularly interesting because I was asked the other day, am I saying this and is my talking about this scaring students? And it's actually students coming to me being like, I'm frightened about going into education because I'm scared I won't be able to afford it. I'm scared I won't be able to get a job. I'm scared the government don't really want me to be safe at university. And I'm hearing that staff are striking. What am I supposed to do if I want to have a good quality education and benefit from the education that, the government and loads of people are telling me is really good, but now I'm lumped with a massive debt to pay. I graduated from uni with 27K debt. Now I look at my student finance account and I don't think I'm going to get a mortgage anytime soon, and that's not fun to think about, given that I really want a kitchen island. I do. That's my thing. Kitchen islands aside, students are worried about living. People in wider society are worried about living. Energy prices are so high. They're so expensive. I live at home with my family. It's so expensive. And so I think what is needed now, because it's a dreary situation, I have to be very clear about that, but I think there is hope. I don't always like to come into panels and be like, it's all dreary, good night, don't sleep and toss and turn. I think there's hope for us to change things. I think there's hope to make opportunities to change things. I just think that people need to change the perspective that they're looking at it from. A marketized higher education system was never really going to work, and this whole sort of push and pull agenda of the government to pump money here and take money from there doesn't work, because further and higher education should be working together. Students and staff should be, bonded together. Universities should be massive supporters and advocates of staff, of students to government and of the benefits of higher education. And I think the past 2 years have been difficult for us. the past 12 years have been difficult for us, right? And I think us as a sector, we need to come together and talk about the benefits, but also talk about it in context of the reality we find ourselves in and the fact that we need a different steer. And I think that's where we need to go with it. I've been talking for ages.
I want to come. Can David Willits hear me? I'm going to come to you next, if I may, because obviously two things there that I heard that you might want to reflect on. I mean, obviously with the fees, I suppose you would probably argue against that. Actually, there's been an expansion of places for disadvantaged students since that fee regime has been introduced. So the evidence is arguably for that fee regime. But the second point that I know you've also written about is on the intergenerational point. So there may be a specific debate around fees, but there's also this general point that we've heard on the panel, that the cost of living crisis, that policy generally seems to be hitting young people harder, and therefore their lives are maybe not going as well as we would hope. I was curious about your thoughts on that too.
Yeah, and well, there is a lot to comment on, and I'll try to be brief. I mean, I think in terms of what Hillary said, what the NUS say. First of all, I loved her enthusiasm about higher education, which is the most important single point. For what she's just said, I half agree. The bit that I agree with is the pressure, the cash pressures on students managing day-to-day their finances now. I completely understand those pressures. And in all my conversations with the NUS when I was minister, and I always valued those interactions, when the NUS came to see me, it was that pressure point for young people now at university that they focused on quite rightly. But I think, if I may say so, I thought Hillary kind of moved between that and a completely different question, which is how we fund higher education by expecting graduates to pay back if they're in a well-paid job. And that future payment is 9% of earnings above a high threshold. That threshold is going to be £25,000 for future students. That means that if you're earning £30,000, you'll be paying 9% on the top £5,000 of your income. That's about £40 a month. And I'd just like to offer Hillary one crucial assurance, because I checked this when she said, I won't be able to get a mortgage. I checked this out with the Council of Mortgage Lenders before we did any of this. And of course, they completely understand that graduate debt is not like debt on a credit card or an overdraft. They're not going to say, oh, we can't lend you £100,000 because you've got £50,000 of debt, so we're only going to lend you £50,000. They completely understand it's not debt like that. It is a fixed outgoing coming through PAYE out of your earnings. So they will say that in the example I've given, if you're earning 30,000, they've got to allow that you've got a £40 a month outgoing. That's what it is. It is not debt in anything like the conventional sense. And I do think we all have a responsibility here. We all surely, everyone participating in this conference knows students don't pay up front. They'll only pay back afterwards, and they'll only pay back as a percentage of their earnings above quite a high threshold. And all of us, regardless of our political views, have a shared obligation to help students understand that, because it would be a tragedy if any young person were ever put off applying for university because of some belief they had to pay this money up front, or they had something like a credit card debt at the end of it. And look, I was obviously very aware of the risks of the 9K, and I suppose so for me, it was a great relief when fortunately that message got through. The number of young people going to university has not fallen over the past 10 years, it's gone up. And one thing it's made it possible to do is, in the old days, when this was direct public spending, governments of all parties controlled public spending by controlling university places. They control the number of people going to university. It's still the Scottish system. And I tell you, when there's a limit on the number of students who go to university, it's the people from the marginal backgrounds and the disadvantaged who lose out. And as a result of shifting to a graduate repayment model, we were able to get rid of the number controls. So the total number of young people going to university has gone up, and that's been particularly helpful for people from marginal groups. So this is undoubtedly a progressive policy, because it only requires people in well-paid jobs to pay back, and it's enabled more students from disadvantaged backgrounds to go. But I support Hillary when she says students at university now are under cash pressures. I completely agree with that, and that is an issue on which we could make common cause.
Okay, I'm gonna have to go to the audience. I know that there is a need for more debate on this, but I'm gonna have to take a few more questions and then get Saul and Mary on the conversation too.
Hello, can I come back with a couple of comments on what has just been said? My name's Michelle Morgan, and Lord Willits, back in 2013, you funded, with the HEFCE Phase 2 scheme, one of the projects that I created and led, and Mary's University was part of that, as some colleagues in this room. I rolled out that pre-arrival academic questionnaire at undergraduate level, and time again, this idea that students do not worry about debt on entry is not true. You have great worry and concern about debt and increasing debt, and this is the same at undergrad and postgraduate level. First generation students more likely to be much more concerned about debt and less likely to have support because first generation. Going on to postgraduate widening participation, because very often this is something that's very passionate to me and a very neglected area. You're talking about 9% payback for undergraduate. It's 6% for postgrad. So you're looking at 15%. If the 3% of undergrad is added on, that makes a total payment of 18%. And if for whatever reason there is a decision that the postgraduate loan interest rate has to increase, students who've actually got an undergrad and a postgraduate loan could be paying in excess of 20% if that does go up. Now that is going to be a real challenge. We can look at the statistics from HESA, and I've been examining them in the last year. We saw a massive increase in 2021, and that could have been put down to the pandemic. But if we're not careful, we may very well see the pattern that led to the HEFCE Phase 1 and 2 projects, because we started to see a decline in postgraduate participation. And I think for the economy and for society, that is a very, very worrying trend.
I'm going to take one more question and then go back to the panel for final word each. That's how I'm going to manage this, because we don't have time. But we will continue this debate. I think maybe we'll have to start some sort of email group or something. Okay, that's too old-fashioned. Something else. Do we have one more question from the audience?
Hi, I'm Emma Baines from High Horizons. I'm sorry to change topic completely because I know everyone was enjoying that debate. I just wanted to ask Mary specifically, but others do feel free to jump in. I'm really inspired by the work you did at Lincoln. I live in Stoke-on-Trent, and that's one of the wards that we work with. And it's a deindustrialised town with high working class population, and I'm very keen to protect that because I really love the identity that everyone's got. And I know you were talking about local areas universities creating graduate jobs in the local area, but my worry is I don't want to gentrify the city. So I just wondered if you could talk a little about how it was that you did that with Lincoln, so that we could perhaps replicate it elsewhere.
Okay, so I'm going to give each of the panelists a final answer. I'm going to give Mary a little more time because that question was asked of her, but I'd like you to try to keep it to 2 minutes, please, each.
Okay. Well, I'll just answer the question then. All I want to say on the bigger thing is that this is a debate which actually we can't stop now. Because we have to think about what higher education is going to be like in the future. I remember sitting on a panel with David ages ago when he said he thought we'd still be talking about fees in 2020, I think it was, David, you said at the time. And, well, you've been proved right. We're still talking about fees. And, you know, how we fund higher education and do it in a fair way is I think, a debate we still need to be having. So that's all I'll say about that. But specifically in terms of that, gentrification, I think, happens when people move into an area rather than you trying to work with a community to lift them up and do things with them in ways that they are interested in. I come from a community development background. I really wanted to work on that kind of approach. I have an arts background as well, so we used a lot of techniques around whole systems so that we were not losing the community's voice. We were enhancing the community's voice and helping students to engage with the community and feel part of that community. When I started at Lincoln, there was a huge thing around I can't say the word, you know the word. It was, I was, obviously in higher education, I thought it was unfair. But I was aware that on talking to people from the local communities, they felt their communities were dying. And I needed my students to understand that was how the community felt. And so we had to create an environment in which they could talk to each other. And that's the sort of thing that we did. And from that then came joint projects and joint things that we could do. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, I think that's very, very inspiring. David, then Hillary, then Saul. So 2 minutes each. David, I'm coming to you first, please.
Well, I guess I better answer those two specific challenges. I mean, first of all, look, I'm up for any discussion. I'm still learning, and there's always points to take into account. I recognize we've got an issue with access to master's courses. The only thing I would say, though, is the loans were an addition to what was previously negligible support. They were not some displacement. They were an extra. There were these tiny quasi-commercial career loans run by a bank, which didn't really work. So this was actually a massive extension of cash going to a group of students, another group, postgrads, but absolutely, at some point it will have to be paid back. On the interest rate, the paradox of the interest rate is, of course, as we know, it doesn't affect actually the amount you repay. That formula is 9% above a certain income threshold, so it doesn't affect your outgoings. The reason why the interest rate was put in was to make the policy more progressive. It was put in order that people in very high paid jobs who are going to pay off quickly would put more back. And indeed, the 3% is triggered when your earnings are above about 45,000. So again, it was actually deliberately designed as a progressive feature of the system. Now, it's proved to be very controversial. I'm not surprised it's proved to be controversial. The government are going to lower the interest rate because people are so excited about it. But the underlying reality, the thing we should focus on is the actual amount per month graduates pay back. And I do care about fairness between the generations, and having written on that myself. And I saw this package as overall of benefit to the younger generation, and for two key reasons. First of all, it meant that their university education was better funded than it otherwise would have been. It meant extra money going to universities. Secondly, it enabled more people to go to universities than would have been possible under the old model, particularly from tough backgrounds. And across the life cycle, people only paid back when they were older and in well-paid jobs. That is generationally fair.
Thank you. And Hillary?
Yes. Well, I think there's much to be said, but what I will say is this. I think there's many a debate to be had, I'm sure. I've got 2 months of being paid to debate, so if you want to, email me. But what I will say is that, in all of this space, there's much to debate about the reality of what we're facing now. We also need to do the work to talk about the alternative, right? We can't keep running around in circles talking about what's not working and what needs to be improved unless we have something to, I hate this word, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm using it, benchmark it against. Ooh, scary, don't cancel me on Twitter. But genuinely, I think there's something really important about understanding that, there is an alternative out there and we need to start talking about it. We can't keep dodging and diving and reforming because reform isn't working, and we do need something new. And I'm speaking for the students I represent. Students need something new to feel the hope again that higher education is supposed to give them, because right now they don't have it, and that's the reality. And so particularly for those students that are most afraid, we need to step up and tell them that there is something else that is possible, and we're prepared to work together to make that happen. And that's why I'll end on in a light, hopeful note.
Good, thank you. And Saul, you've got the last word.
So a few points on the fees issue. I mean, I think I mentioned part-time mature students falling through the floor, and I think there was somewhere in the region of 100 to 180,000 students that were missing after those fee changes. And obviously recession austerity also kicked in and hit those students really hard. So I don't think it's entirely true that access, that although for the young participation rate continued to improve, It's not true for part-time mature students, which is something I think that probably David would probably admit, I think. I don't know. I'm putting words in his mouth, sorry. I think that the IFS report that came out in 2014 was quite clear that there would be pressures on people's budgets, particularly as people got older with student loan repayments. Once people are in their 30s and 40s, that they're going to be paying off hundreds of pounds per month. And that is precisely the time when people want to maybe try and get out of the horrendous cycle of renting, get that nice island in the kitchen, maybe have kids, who knows, if people still want to do that. And that is going to hit people. It's undoubtedly going to hit people. And the new changes, from what I understand, in the extension of the loan period, are also going to make things actively a bit more aggressive. In terms of the question about place, I think the thing that universities have to do, and I actually think it involves rethinking what universities are as part of that process. We need a non-paternalistic way of thinking about the university's role within communities, and that means with other education institutions. It also means not doing things which universities have done historically, buying up bits of land, sometimes bits of social housing. LSE was built on a 19th century slum in part. I don't know where those people went to live. Other universities worldwide have done the same thing. There's a different model needed there that I think still needs to be argued for, to be created, and I think that has to be done by students and staff that work in universities, really challenging themselves to build something better and to understand the way that inequalities work within the communities that they work in. And universities are, you know, what bell hooks say, that they're not a paradise, but they're a space where paradise can be created, and I think that is what sustains so many of us students and staff in higher education.
That's a good note to end on, a place where paradise can be created. I don't know if today has been paradise for you, but I hope you've enjoyed the conference. I've really enjoyed it. I want to thank the panelists first before my closing remarks. And I am kind of slightly over my closing remarks, and I realize we're going to a drinks reception now, so I will just keep them tight. I do think that this panel has shown the value of one of the things that David Willits highlighted, and Hillary as well, which is free speech. I think this was a really lively debate. I know we could have gone on for another half hour. I would look forward to that. Be happy to host another debate. Maybe I'm sure David Willits, 10 years on, is going to be giving quite a few talks on tuition fees and their fairness. But today was about more than just tuition fees. It was about the wider questions of inequalities in higher education. It was great to see you all in person. I'm really, this was our first in-person event on our first birthday, more or less. I'm really grateful to my staff, to my team who helped put this together, especially to the communications team. That's Chloe, Alicia, and of course, Adam. Yes. There was a little bit of, we haven't put on an in-person event in a while, but their muscle memory sort of kicked in, and I think everybody enjoyed themselves. Great food. Thank you also to the tech and the filming. It's been a great day. And thanks to all of you for coming. Please do continue to look at our website. We're going to be continuing, as you know, this year to update a lot. Our second year is going to have even more outputs, and we hope that those outputs will encourage you to continue this conversation that we started today, to try to do more work to maybe have a little bit of paradise in higher education, but certainly to tackle inequality so that students can have better lives. Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks.